Hey everyone, Heero here, and today we're gonna look at Yidhari, a DPS that relies on constantly being at low health to empower her attacks to deal massive damage. I'll be discussing her kit, builds, engines, and possible themes. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information that will be shown is from the Creator Experience server, so things can still change when her banner drops. Now before we start, I'd just like to give a mild spoiler warning since this video will contain footage of the new Wandering Hunter boss. Now let's look at her core passive since her entire playstyle revolves around it. First of all, she has the standard Rupture agent loadout. It has the HP to sheer force conversion, makes it so all of Yidhari's ice damage is considered as sheer damage, while giving her 60 adrenaline at the start of combat. But aside from this, her core passive also has HP related benefits. First of all, Yidhari's damage increases as her HP gets lower, with her getting a max 100% damage buff once her HP goes below 50%. However, the max buff will only stay for 5 seconds if Yidhari's HP goes back over 50%, after which the buff value goes back down to reflect how much HP Yidhari has. So it's very important Yidhari stays below 50% HP for a majority of the battle, and you only use her most damaging abilities then, since not having her full 100% damage buff causes a very big difference in her damage output. But moving on, Yidhari also gets less decibels from landing skills or attacks, so she mainly gains decibels from losing HP, with her generating 10 decibels for every point of HP she loses. For example, her charge attack can consume a max of 75% of her HP when she's at full health, meaning it can give her up to 750 decibels from that alone. So with the HP consuming and healing aspect of her kit, combined with healers like Lucia and healing bamboos, Yidhari will tend to get her ult much faster compared to other agents. Now let's quickly look at her basic attack, which is a standard 3 attack combo with a third hit healing 10% of Yidhari's HP. It is very important to note that this is only 1 out of 3 ways she can heal herself, but it's very useful since a lot of her combos ends with her basic attack 3. Now let's move on to her charge attack, which has Yidhari charge up while continually consuming HP for as long as you hold the attack button. And the higher HP Yidhari has, the faster HP is consumed, but this attack will never let Yidhari go below 25% HP. Now this attack has 3 levels, with each level being indicated by the hammer glow and how much her bar is charged, with each level of course increasing the charge attack's damage and days dealt by a considerable amount. But at max charge level, Yidhari is able to channel her inner Herta and start spinning with her hammer. After which, you can either press attack or wait till she stops doing her Kuru Kuru to have her do her charge attack's finisher. Her level 2 and 3 charge attacks directly combos into her basic 3 after finishing their finishers by pressing the attack button, which is good for healing and chaining together combos with her EX special. It's also worth to mention that the damage of the basic attack 3 that is triggered is increased depending on the level of the charge attack. She also has a special state called Frost Crushing Weight, which is activated when Yidhari is attacked while charging or spinning, which has Yidhari block and counter with her tentacles while reducing her damage taken by 35%. And if Yidhari is hit while charging and not at full charge, she immediately gains 1 charge level. After which, you have 2 options. You can either tap basic to combo directly into her finisher, or more importantly, tap special to combo into her special attack, Surging Cold. Using her special in this manner is guaranteed to trigger the Surging Cold effect, which is very important since it's only 1 of 2 ways to trigger her strongest EX special, Glacial Crush. Now let's look at her specials, starting with Surging Cold, Crushing Pursuit, which is activated by tapping the special button while charging up or during a spin attack, which can then combo directly into her charge attack's finisher based on the level of charge she has. But if you manage to parry with the attack or you use it after Yidhari blocks, it activates Surging Cold, while if you use it on a stunned enemy, it activates Crushing Pursuit, which is basically the same thing since they both instantly increase her charge level to max and are required to use her strongest EX special, Glacial Crush. Speaking of which, Glacial Crush is her most damaging ability next to her ult and it requires triggering Surging Cold or Crushing Pursuit with enough adrenaline to activate. It's also worth noting that this attack heals 33% of her HP, and if used after Surging Cold, which is the parry by the way, it will grant 15 adrenaline, allowing players to spam it more outside of stuns. This attack also directly combos into the finisher of her charge attack, and you do want to spam it often for healing, not only to keep Yidhari alive, but to also give her more HP to consume to get her ult. Now she also has another EX special called Frost Coil, which is pretty normal, but it also does heal 33% of her max HP. However, as much as possible, you want to save her adrenaline for her EX special Glacial Frost instead of using this attack. This is because Glacial Crush not only has the same adrenaline cost, but it also deals more damage while also enabling Yidhari to deal high damage combos. But moving on, she also provides the Ether Veil Wellspring buff, which is activated by using her charge attack, EX special attacks, and chain attack to consume 3000 decibels. This lasts for 30 seconds, but it can be refreshed by up to 300 seconds by activating it again. And it increases every party member's max HP by 5%, and as an exclusive benefit for Yidhari, when it's active, it increases her charge speed and her HP consumption rate. It is also very important to note that this is the exact same buff Lucia provides, meaning it does not stack with Lucia's and it shares the exact same cooldown. But despite this, Lucia is very helpful in keeping its uptime, cause Yidhari on her own has a very difficult time refreshing the buff if she can't get her ult within 30 seconds. Now moving on to her ult, which is a fairly standard high damage AoE, but it does have a few aspects that make it unique, which is that it remains locked until you activate Yidhari's Ether Veil Wellspring by spending 3000 decibels. After which, it unlocks her ult, and you have 30 seconds to use it with no extra decibel cost. This allows Yidhari to save her ult for big damage instances like stuns without causing decibel overflow to prevent reducing the number of ults Yidhari can trigger in one battle. As for her additional ability, it needs a stun or support unit to activate. This buffs Yidhari's crit damage by 30%, while reducing the damage she takes by 25% after her HP drops below 50%. This combined with her self-heals and her auto-blocks damage reduction essentially makes her very hard to kill, so you won't really have to worry about her survivability. Now her additional ability also gives her an additional attack instance after using her level 3 charge finisher or her EX special Glacial Charge. This is a special tentacle attack that has an internal cooldown of 12 seconds and scales off her special attack talent level. But with her kit out of the way, let's talk about her Mindscapes. Her M1 lowers both of her EX specials cost to 50 from 60, increases the amount healed by Glacial Crush by 100% of its original amount, while enabling her EX specials and basics to ignore 20% ice res. But aside from this, it enables you to forego the healing effects of her EX special for the ability to consume an additional 35 adrenaline to combo into another Glacial Crush by holding the attack or special button. While her M2 increases her crit damage by 40%, and whenever Yidhari triggers Surging Cold or Crushing Pursuit, it increases her adrenaline generation rate by 0.5 per second for 30 seconds. Which of course is neat for spamming more EX specials, especially since this buff can last for majority of the battle, due to you wanting to constantly trigger Surging Cold and Crushing Pursuit to use her stronger EX special. As for her M4, it enables any Ether Veil Wellspring buff to give Yidhari an additional 5% HP for a total of a 10% HP buff, which is neat for damage. Aside from this, it also increases the amount of decibel she gains from losing HP by 10%, which isn't really too crazy since it causes her to gain 11 decibels from every point of HP lost instead of 10, or 825 decibels instead of 750 when losing 75% HP, which isn't really too game-breaking, but it is appreciated. And finally, for her M6, it gives her the erudition buff every time the Ether Veil Wellspring is activated or extended. This buff increases her sheer damage by 25%, and upon taking fatal damage for the first time in battle, her HP instead is reduced to 1 while preventing her from dying for 5 seconds. after which it heals 25% of her max HP over time. And with her Mindscapes out of the way, let's talk about her possible Wenjins. Yidhari's signature Wenjin, Kraken's Cradle, gives 30% HP with its main stat, and every time she takes damage, she gains a 60% Ice Shear damage buff. This stacks up to 3 times for a max of an 18% buff, and each stack has an independent duration of 25 seconds. However, once Yidhari goes below 50% HP, this Wenjin also gives her a 20% crit rate buff for as long as she stays below 50% HP. Overall, this Wenjin is not only a great upgrade for her damage, but also makes her way easier to build with its bonus crit rate and HP. Now, her only free-to-play alternative is Puzzle Sphere, which buffs her crit damage by 25% for 12 seconds after using an EX special, while also buffing her EX special damage by 32% if the enemy is below 50% HP. Which is great since a lot of her damage comes from her EX specials. However, sadly, it has a few downsides. First of all is that it gives attack instead of HP with its main stat, so less sheer force. And second, it's not too good for Deadly Assault since it requires the enemies to be below 50% HP, which is extremely hard to do due to Deadly Assault bosses' larger HP pools. But it should still be a great option for other content like Shield Defense. As for other options, Qingming Birdcage is a great HP and crit rate stat stick. Its only downside is its ether-related buffs are useless for Yidhari. Radio Wave Journey can work too for its HP main stat. However, outside of ulting and double chain attacking during stuns, Yidhari will have a hard time stacking and maintaining this Wenjin's buffs, which is something to consider if you plan to run her in a double support team. And finally, Grillo Wisp can work too since it also gives HP. Just note its fire damage bonus is useless for her and its crit rate buff only lasts for 5 seconds after HP consumption, which is barely fits her charge into EX special into charge finisher combo. However, the buff is too short for any longer combo, such as if you incorporate a basic attack 3 into the end of the combo I just mentioned. Another important note, you also have to make sure you hold charge right before using her ult so that it gets this Wenjin's crit rate buff. But with possible Wenjins out of the way, let's talk about drive discs. In the 4-piece set, her best set is Yinkui Tails. It's really the only set you should consider for her since it's the only set that can provide sheer force and HP to buff her damage while also making her easier to build with its crit rate buff. But just note, you'll need to use her EX special within a 15-second window to maintain its buffs outside of stuns. Or you also have the option of using a double chain attack into ult combo during stuns to maintain its buffs. As for the 2-piece set, she has 3 options: Woodpecker for crit rate, Branch for crit damage, or Polar Metal for ice damage. Out of the 3, Woodpecker is the best for its crit rate bonus, making her easier to build, while Polar Metal can potentially be the worst depending on the team you're running, since it is very possible to get quite a bit of damage percent buffs with Yidhari, especially if you're using her with lighter. But with her possible drive discs out of the way, let's talk about stats. Now, before we get into her stats, it's very important to note that as a Rupture agent, she already ignores all enemy defenses, so pen stats from a slot 5 main stat or substats are useless for her. But with that being said, you want crit for slot 4, HP or ice for slot 5, and HP for slot 6, which is your fairly standard Rupture class DPS build. Now for the slot 5 main stat, ice damage is good for general use. However, it's worth noting that Yidhari can get quite a bit of damage percent buffs already from her kit, Wenjins, and teammates, so it's very easy to dilute the stat and get diminishing returns. This makes HP percent just as viable as an ice damage slot 5, so just pick whichever one has the best substats. But if you're running her with lighter with this additional ability active, HP becomes the best choice since he already gives a lot of ice damage buffs. As for substats, you mainly want to focus on crit stats first, then HP percent, then flat HP, then finally attack stats. Again, attack is not useless for Rupture agents since they convert 30% of their attack into sheer force, but HP is still more desired since they can get more sheer force from it. Now for stat goals, I recommend around 16 to 20k HP in order to get loss of sheer force and deal loss of damage, but getting more isn't a bad idea, though only do so once you balance your crit stats. But speaking of which, for crit rate, I recommend around 80 to 100% in battle in order to ensure consistent crits. Now she does have a bit of crit rate sources already, like her core level up bonus, but if you're having trouble getting some, you can go as low as 75%. However, I don't really recommend going lower since you'll end up risking an inconsistent damage output. As for crit damage, I recommend aiming for 120 to 150% crit damage out of battle to help ensure she deals big damage. Just note, this does not include the crit damage buff from her additional ability. With her stats out of the way, let's talk about possible teammates. Now for starters, her current best partner is Lucia for quite a bit of reasons. First of all, not only does she provide Yidhari with the biggest sheer force buff in the game, she also doesn't compete with her too much for field time, giving Yidhari plenty of time to deal damage. This is on top of her ult ceiling, also helping Yidhari generate her ult a bit faster if you need the extra decibels to squeeze in an ult in a high damage rotation. However, the most important benefit Lucia brings is her ability to maintain the Ether Veil Wellsprings uptime. Now sadly, Yidhari and Lucia's Ether Veil Wellsprings do not stack, but Yidhari has a hard time maintaining it on her own. So with Lucia, Yidhari is able to take advantage of the faster charge speed and 5% HP buff for pretty much the entire battle. This is much more important than it seems since the difference in charge speed is pretty significant. And having it active helps you spam more Yidhari charge attacks to squeeze in a bit more damage, especially during stuns after you've exhausted all of Yidhari's adrenaline. So with all these benefits, pairing Lucia with Yidhari will result in a very noticeable improvement in Yidhari's performance. However, if you don't have her, supports like Astra, Pan Yin-Hu, Caesar, or even Sokaku can work, albeit just not as good as Lucia, but even teams without her should still perform pretty decently. But now let's look at her possible teams. Yidhari is your pretty standard DPS when it comes to team building. You can either run her in a double support team or your standard hyper carry comp with a stunner or support. With the best variation of course having Lucia or Yufufu, but if you don't have Yufufu, stunners like Trigger, Lycon, or Lighter can also work. Just note, don't use Trigger Signature if you plan to run Yidhari with Trigger since its defense shred is useless for Rupture agents. In this case, it's much better to use an option that gives more days like Fossilized Core. Now let's first look at the performance of the teams with Lucia. These tests were done with the Wandering Hunter Deadly Assault boss. Every A-rank agent was at M6, while every S-rank agent was at M0, and every agent apart from Trigger had their signatures. But with that in mind, the scores you see here are due to many variables like my skill issue, so they are bound to change depending on your skill level, team builds, wenjins, and more. Out of all the teams with Lucia, the comp with Yufufu performed the best, scoring a high 47k, which is considerably higher than any other team I tested. But overall, any team with Lucia was able to achieve a pretty high score and are among the best for Yidhari teams. However, in terms of gameplay comfortability and ease of use, it differs vastly depending on the team. For example, the teams with Yufufu, Caesar, Trigger, Astra, Lighter, Pokra, and Coletta is considerably easier to play due to them giving more field time for Yidhari. This is on top of providing buffs that are easier to keep track of one way or another, which lets you just focus on wailing on the boss. But the same can't be said about the teams with Pan Yin-Hu, Sokaku, Lycon, and Chingy. Pan Yin-Hu and Sokaku provides buffs that you have to keep track of to ensure their uptime. However, with the Wandering Hunter boss in particular, it might get overwhelming since you also have to keep track of Lucia's dream state while ensuring the boss's debuffs never expire, otherwise you'll have to stack it again, which of course will result in a damage loss. As for Lycon and Chingy, it's really just the field time management that makes it hard to play. Now this issue does become a bit worse with Chingy since no Yidhari team can activate her additional ability. But this issue of field time management is easier to get around with Yidhari, so it's not really too big of an issue with more practice. Just make sure you on-field Yidhari for enough time to spam enough of her EX specials and charge attacks to have her ult and at least one EX special ready by the time of a stun. Now for the teams with Astra Yao, the best team without Lucia would be the one with Yufufu being able to score a good 40k. These teams are overall just a downgrade compared to their counterparts with Lucia in them, performing on average 15 to 18% worse. However, as you can see from the scores, they are still pretty good teams that scored pretty high in Deadly Assault, so even without Lucia, Yidhari can still definitely perform well. It's also worth noting that out of all the teams with Astra are the more comfortable ones since you'll barely have to switch into her and you don't really have to keep track of her buffs. As for Pan Yin Hu teams, well, they perform pretty similarly and in some cases better than Astra teams, which is to be expected since he provides bigger sheer force buffs as well as a damage vulnerability debuff. However, when comparing the teams that had Lucia instead of Pan Yin Hu, his teams performed 17 to 22% worse. This is mostly due to his teams being a bit harder and less comfortable to play compared to Astra and Lucia teams. This is mostly due to his teams being a bit harder and less comfortable to play compared to Astra and Lucia teams. Because like I said earlier, especially for this fight, some of Pan Yin Hu's teams have a lot of buffs to keep track of, and when combined with a heavy focus on keeping uptime on the Wandering Hunter's debuff stacks, it can get pretty overwhelming for some players. And if you forget to reapply even one buff, or even lose all of the Wandering Hunter's debuff stacks, it will definitely cause a big damage drop-off. However, for easier content and bosses, this shouldn't become too much of an issue, so Pan Yin Hu teams will become easier to play for them. As for the Sokaku teams, outside of the pairing with Lucia, they were the worst performing teams, performing 20 to 30% worse than the teams that had Lucia instead of Sokaku. Now, despite Sokaku's buffs being curated for ice units, what lets her down and is the main cause in the difference in performance is how long it takes to refresh them and them lasting shorter than Pan Yin Hu's buffs. So not only does she take up more field time, you'll also have to switch into her more often compared to someone like Pan Yin Hu, which of course causes Yidhari to have less time to deal damage. But with that being said, she also has the same issue as Pan Yin Hu in terms of keeping an eye on buffs and how hectic it can get with this boss. However, like I said earlier, these scores are highly influenced by my skill issue, and I'm sure some of you out there can use Sokaku with Yidhari more effectively than I can. Now, let's finally talk about lighter teams. He is a very special case. This is because a lot of his teams with Yidhari will not have his additional ability active, meaning you'll end up losing a huge 75% ice damage buff for most teams. And the only teams that can have his additional ability active are the ones with a Sons of Caledon unit like Lucy and Caesar, or an attack unit like Orphe. Now, lighter with these units enabled Yidhari to perform extremely well due to her having all of lighter's buffs. But just note, the Orphe plus lighter team is extremely hard to play due to how short Orphe's buffs are for non-aftershock units. So you'll end up having to switch into her very often to use her on-field special to keep her buffs uptime for Yidhari. Now sadly, because of that, I wasn't really able to bring out the team's full potential, and the boss had a 40% defense buff, so Orphe wasn't really dealing too much damage. As for the teams without Lighter's additional ability, well, surprisingly, they perform pretty well. Lighter without this additional ability essentially becomes a slightly better Lycon in this case. Now, despite Lycon having a higher Ice Rush Red debuff alongside a stun multiplier buff, Lighter's fast stunning, considerably lower field time, and signature allows him to outperform Lycon by around 3% even without his additional ability. Plus, he also extends stun durations, which allows Yidhari to perform longer combos during stuns. Now, it's worth noting that Lighter will perform on par or a bit worse than Lycon if you don't have a signature in this particular case, since you lose out on its 30% ice crit damage buff. However, for teams that have Lighter's additional ability active, the difference in performance becomes much more clear and Lighter will definitely be better. But that's about it, but there's just one last question. Is she a must-pull? Well, as usual, it depends on your account. She's not really a must-pull if you already have a top-tier Ice DPS like Miyabi or a Rupture DPS like Yishuan. Having either of them already covers you for Ice Week or Rupture-focused content, and to this day, these units still hold up great against modern stages. In this case, it's much better to save for characters you need or want. Remember, new characters were recently revealed, so saving for them isn't really a bad idea. However, Yidhari is definitely a must-pull if you need a good ice DPS. She's an ice DPS that is able to carry you through the game's hardest content, no problem. She deals a lot of damage, has plenty of team options, and most important of all, she's pretty fun to play with her bonking every single enemy you come across. But at the end of the day though, if you like Yidhari, pull for her, and if you don't, well don't. Personally, I'm definitely gonna be pulling for her because she has a pretty big hammer. What did you think I was gonna say, I mean, just look at her spin around bonking everything. It's pretty funny if you ask me. But anyway, make sure to tell me what you think about her in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub. Now, onto the showcases. Remember, I suck at this game, so please forgive my skill issue.